Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
So, David, what are we talking about today?
Let's talk about the various ways in which people submit invalid arguments. In particular, paradoxes as a superset of contradictions, tautologies, and other various fallacies.
All right, so we're pretty much just talking about logical proponents of arguments in general, like typically the negative ones, the ones that can lead to the invalidity of a claim.
Well, specifically, we want to talk about where logic is violated.
Okay.
Where you depart from making a logical argument, or in the case of tautologies, in which you present an argument that is logical but meaningless.
Okay. That'll make for a good title, where logic is violated or meaningless. That's the main thing I'm trying to get out of you when I ask you what the topic for today is.
I see.
Because I haven't put together a formal title. And you can't be too long. You gotta be catchy.
It's gonna be catchy.
Yeah. Alright, so you'll let you start us off with that.
Alright, so, when preparing for this, I, looked up Ye Olde Oxford for the definition of a paradox, and I found something hilarious, actually.
Was it paradoxical?
Two definitions which contradict each other.
They may have done that on purpose.
They may have done that on purpose, but it's fantastic. But actually, both definitions hold up.
Oh.
Yes, both definitions are good in their own context. So,
okay.
There's a positive and a negative type of paradox as defined here.
Okay.
So the positive type, it's defined as a seemingly absurd or contradictory statement or proposition which when investigated may prove to be well-founded or true. So, for instance, let's visit physics. Okay?
Sure.
Quantum mechanics.
Okay.
According to our current understanding of quantum mechanics, you end up with situations in which a particle can seem to be in more than one place at once. This seems impossible. Nothing's in two places at once, right? It's a paradox. But actually,
when you measure it,
it holds up.
It collapses.
Thinking about it that way works.
Right.
So that's that kind of paradox. It seems contradictory, but really it isn't. So then the other type is the type that most people are familiar with. A statement or proposition which, despite sound reasoning, or apparently sound reasoning, from acceptable premises, leads to a conclusion that seems logically unacceptable or self-contradictory.
Okay. That's probably the one we're going to be talking about today.
Yes.
Or technically both, because we don't know whether a statement is paradoxical or not until you say it.
Right. So what I like about these two definitions, or particularly the first definition, this teaches us an important lesson about logic. That it's very easy to put forth an axiom that isn't actually true. For instance, people might have held as an axiom that one thing cannot exist in two places.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, if someone proposed this particle exists in two places, we would immediately philosophically throw this out as nonsense.
Right.
But that doesn't hold up against reality. Or at least we haven't come up with a better way to describe it, which gets rid of that conclusion. And so we have to be, when we start talking about axioms in a philosophical system or a logical system, we need to be very careful that our axioms make no claims about reality. Because if they do, we may run up against reality.
Right. It just occurred to me that I don't have a technical definition for the word axiom. We use it a lot, but I don't think we've ever defined it. And in
so I will attempt to define it.
Okay.
An axiom in a logical system is an assertion which serves as the basis for the logical system, which cannot be derived from other logical principles.
Okay. The definition I'm getting from the Oxford is a statement or proposition which is regarded as being established, accepted, or self-evidently true.
So,
Or in mathematics, a
Yeah.
statement or proposition on which an abstractly defined structure is based.
Right. That's the way that I was using it. And that's the way it should be used when we're talking about formal logic. Because otherwise, axiom just becomes assertion, really.
Right.
Assertion without premises. So in mathematics, we have, mathematics is a philosophical system, and so it is based on axioms. We might take the axioms of the real number system. Let's talk about, what does equality mean? Well, there are certain rules of equality. Every real number x is equal to itself. That's an axiom. You can't prove that or derive it from any other way. We just assert x equals x because that's what we mean when we say equality.
Right.
So a good axiom should be definitional in nature. It should define something. It should not describe something.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to say, is that in a way you can look at, well, that's why I think we go so far into, I feel like sometimes we use definitions and axioms sometimes interchangeably when we talk, because really, for what they're used, they're similar. When we say let's talk about what we're talking about, we're really defining our axioms there, because if they are definitional, then the definition needs to be universally applicable. I think that's the other thing too about an axiom, where like when we talk about the equivocation principle or the equivalence principle in mathematics, it's universal, and everywhere within the system that it is used as a base unit of forming the system of mathematics, everywhere in that domain it is true, and it is always true. It is a universal.
Right. So what makes axioms maybe a little bit different from just plain old definitions is that axioms normally, at least in mathematics, they describe rules, whereas definitions are like descriptions of things that have characteristics.
Right.
So, for instance, another axiom might be for any two real numbers, they are either equal or one is less than the other.
Okay.
Right. And so then we're making sort of a claim about these two hypothetical numbers, but really it's part of the definition of the number system that we're talking about.
Right.
And with the real number system, it's definitional because it is a component of the full definition of the real numbers.
Okay. Well, I think this actually serves as a strangely excellent segue into what tautologies are.
Yes.
Because a tautology is a statement or an assertion that is, by its very nature, always true.
Right.
Which can sound a lot like what an axiom is. But I think the real difference comes from one being descriptive and one being definitional. Would you agree?
Right. Well, you can also make a tautology based on axioms. You might say I'll take a really easy one. If x equals x, then x equals x. Of course.
Yes. And I think the thing about tautologies is the fact that they're always true does speak a lot to their uselessness.
Right.
Now, I would argue that they are not always useless.
The times when they're useful is normally really deep inside formal logic, in which you need to take a roundabout path in order to establish that this other thing is actually a tautology.
Right.
Where it wasn't obvious just by looking at the proposition that it was a tautology.
Right. So I do know that you'll hear a lot of people, especially when you start digging around in the epistemology circles, that there is this tautology is almost a dirty word in the epistemological study in circles.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's because generally speaking, or in general, they are useless. But I do think it's important to caveat here because we're trying to be fair about it. And in my research, I did come across a couple of people trying to make points for tautology, like make the case for tautologies. And generally, when they did, they brought it to where you did, where they're useful in the lowest levels and the true bowels of logic when you have nowhere else to go, and you have to find a floor somewhere. And ultimately, and that's down where your axioms are as well. And there's a tendency sometimes, usually when people are trying to move very quickly, to call out your axiom as a tautology, where that's not always the case. It's at that point you have to kind of step back from, labeling a claim or an assertion and really take a look at what it is and determine whether it is axiomatic or a tautology. So, right. Now, if there are statements that are always true, we call them tautologies. Mm-hmm. There are also statements that are always false, and I would argue just as useless. Mm-hmm. Contradictions. Right. Which, those are pretty... I feel like there is another logical term for a proposition that's always false in the identical way to a tautology always being true, but I've forgotten what the word is. I didn't come across it in my research. It's not used very often because normally you don't come across them. Right. Well, not in pure logic scenarios, but in the epistemological, I guess. There yes. You go. Pardon me fumbling over my words here. You tried. I did. I do. We're not necessarily in the deepest bowels of logic and strict logic, because typically epistemology is striving for the truth in a much more pragmatic and practical sense, especially when you're dealing with individuals, like street epistemology and so on. I'm saying in the more popular forms, that's what it's, you'll see contradictions a lot more often when people are just ad hominem or ad hoc throwing up their, mm-hmm. Belief systems and stuff like that. So you tend to run into contradictions a lot more often. And I think it's, contradictions also gets used in a case when you just have two conflicting right. assertions. Contradictions seem to show up more often in people's actual beliefs, and tautologies tend to show up more when people are trying to formalize an argument. Right. Well, I would argue that contradictions can show up there as well, but I think it's important to keep in mind that contradictions can exist between two different claims and contained within a single claim mm-hmm. as well. A good example of this is, I can't really come up with the top of my head with a good one for just a single claim, but typically, Jack is a dog, mm-hmm. and Jack is not a dog. Right. It's like, well, what? That obviously can't be possible. John is a married bachelor. Right. That's another good one. Yes. I don't know why I can't think of the good ones that I've heard 1,000 times when I'm trying to come up with them off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm just trying to be original too much. I don't know. So those are tautologies and contradictions. What else do you have in... Well, so sort of related to tautologies, the first fallacy that I wanted to talk about is begging the question, which is very close to stating a tautology. It's very deep down in my notes, David. That's your fault. So, okay, I guess I should state what begging the question is for those who don't know. Yes. Begging the question is actually a misnomer, by the way. Yes, it is. It means assuming the conclusion. When in a formal argument, if one of the premises of your argument either is directly or relies upon the conclusion in order to be true, then you're begging the question. Right. And I think that the thing that was incorrectly translated from actually did mean assuming the conclusion. And whoever translated it from probably Latin to English translated it as begging the question. Right. The definition I pulled out of it was assuming an assertion is true in order to cite evidence to support the same assertion. Right. Just, different words, same meaning, but I agree. And you'll also, if you pay attention to my language, you'll notice I never say this begs the question. I always say this raises the question. Because these are different things. These are different things. Raising and begging are two different things. Yes. Okay. So, sometimes begging the question is hard to notice in an argument, though. There are
there are many sneaky ways that you can hide question begging in an argument.
Right.
I think my favorite is the ontological argument for God. Have you heard this?
I have heard this, but you're probably more fluent in it.
So the ontological argument goes as follows. Define God to be a maximally great being, whatever that is. Premise 2, a great being is made greater by existing. Therefore, a maximally great being must exist. Therefore, God exists.
Right. I've heard the longer version, which is, a great being, a great being exists in at least one of all possible realities. And then a greater being would then exist in all possible realities, including our reality. That kind of tries to factor in and compensate for the multiverse theory of, which isn't
really a theory.
Which is wickedly misquoted, I know, but when you're dealing with woo-woo,
yes,
woo-wooers like to woo-woo together.
So some people get really hung up on it, and I'll admit that this, it did trip me up for a little while. I mean, I knew that there was something fishy about it, about basically defining something into existence, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. But if you really break it down, it makes sense. The fallacy jumps out at you. So let's think about, okay, God is a maximally great being. A maximally great being exists. Okay. So then, if we back that up and combine the two premises into one, we say, God is a being that exists.
Right.
Which is really the premise. And so then we have, okay, God exists, therefore God exists. Okay, we have a tautology. It's question begging.
Right. And I think, especially for begging the question, because I have quite a few fallacies I'd like to go through. Some of them I don't even really consider fallacies, even though they were stated as such, but we'll get there when we get there.
Yeah.
But a lot of these deal with simple substitution. Like, that's a great way to break them down, like you just did. You take the definition, God is a maximally great being. Okay, so now every time you see maximally great being, drop the word God in there, and you can really quickly sort out definitional tautologies like that that are arbitrary or descriptional tautologies, because it's really what you're doing. A maximally great being is a description.
You're burying the tautology in definitions.
Right, which is really effective because people, a lot of the time, and this kind of goes back to what we talked about with different ideas being better than others, but maybe skew to the idea of definitions. People generally are accepting of other definitions, as long as they're laid out for you. If someone walks into your house and asks to use the loo, okay, that's not what you define or name a bathroom. That's not what you label that, because that's really all definitions are, labels. But if they tell you, if you've had the context to know what that means, you just generally accept that is an additional definition, and that's fine, And there's another fallacy that comes really on the heels of that as well, and that is the equivocation fallacy. Doesn't generally have the word fallacy following. It's just called equivocation. But that's when you conflate two definitions of a word to form a false or misleading statement or series of statements, because let's just take the same example, maximally great being, okay? You're co-opting maximally and greatness into possibly other definitions that you really mean, because generally, people, when they start defining God, don't stop at they're just great. That is also begging the question as to, well, what is great? And, that's raising the question. What is greatness? And that, it's a great segue into your other talks.
Followed up by an appeal to emotion that, well, something's better if it exists, right?
Well, okay. I need to move on to my other one. There's appealing to emotions in here as well. There are a bunch of appeals. I don't really like
appeals aren't really fallacies. They're just bad arguments.
They are bad arguments because, most appeals are ways of substituting an actual argument. Most fallacies actually are substitutions for arguments.
Well, they're pseudo arguments. That's what a fallacy is.
Right. So let's go through the appeals first.
Okay.
I think those are the easiest ones
appeals.
to just write off.
All right, so appeal to emotion has already been mentioned.
Right, and that was the first one I had. The second one is the appeal to popularity, or the bandwagon principle.
Yep.
And that's when, well, if 500 million people do it, it can't be wrong, or
Right.
if 500 million people subscribe to Netflix must be great, Whereas most of the time, citing how frequently people accept something, and that's really that's really where you got to be specific, because there are cases where, a common occurrence of something happening or a state of occurrence can be relevant data, because that's what studies are, is looking over sample sets. But appeals to popularity is simply the widespread acceptance of other people. Mm-hmm. So, not real evidence, because really easy. I'll go ahead and cite the next one as a reason why I can also be wrong. I'm gonna use a fallacy to prove wrong another fallacy. Mm-hmm. That's the appeal to tradition, which is citing a prolonged acceptance.
We've always done this, therefore it's the right thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, we've always, people say we've always done, just like the appeal to popularity. It used to be pretty commonplace that, well, if you're manipulating numbers, you must be a witch.
Right.
And we got to burn you, Now, not only was that a traditional opinion that was held for shockingly long periods of time, but it was also a pretty popular opinion. And it still is in certain cultures in the world. Not to point fingers or anything, but there are cultures that exist in the world that still hold what we would be considered to be very traditional beliefs. That doesn't make them right or wrong, Essentially, and that's the thing. We're not saying these prove things wrong necessarily. We'll get to that fallacy.
No, because something can be backed up by tradition and also be true.
Exactly. The fact of the matter is, though, these appeals are just not evidence.
Right.
So you can't, if it's not evidence, it can't be used to support a true or a false assignment. The next appeal is the appeal to nature.
I was going to bring that up next. Very good. So, yeah, this is natural, therefore it's better.
Pretty much. Well, it's asserting that naturally occurring things are flawless due to their lack of ability to be wrong, thus they are right.
Okay.
So there's a compound fallacy going on behind it we'll get to, but essentially saying this kind of plays on and could kind of jive with the previous idea we had stated with, well, morality is a human thing, right? Right. So if it's not human, it can't be moral. The problem is, well, if it's not moral, then it must be good. That's where the jump happens, where that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, nature exists forever also, kind of playing on tradition as well, so it must be good. And the last appeal that I have on here, which I think, let me make sure. Yeah, it's the last appeal I have on here, is the appeal to ignorance. Mm. And this one you see, I think, is the most common. Oh no, there's two more, sorry. The appeal to ignorance is one I think I see the most common. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially people saying, well, the definition is citing the lack of information as a determining factor in assigning a truth value.
Right.
And this is typically used to preserve status quos, because if you're appealing to ignorance, generally you'll hear people say, look, you don't really know, I don't really know, there's not enough evidence, we should just move on. And that's a good way when you're wanting to end the argument or end the discussion, leaving both people's belief systems intact, which can typically happen when you are on your heels in an argument. It's a lot easier to come to the, let's just agree to disagree.
I think that's a good way to segue into two other fallacies based on that.
I've got one more though. We've got to do the last appeal, and that's the appeal to authority.
I was going to bring up the appeal to authority. Mm-hmm.
Well, David, I'm doing the appeal to authority. And that's essentially citing an individual. And when I say individual here, that doesn't necessarily mean a person, because sometimes appeals to authority are to other things that somehow hold authority.
Say old books.
Old books or God. Anyway, citing an individual's authority or right to authority as the supporting argument, essentially just saying this is right because this said so. Like, this is the oldest one in the book, in my opinion, because this is the first fallacy we're all introduced to when we're kids. When your parents, when you ask your parents to do something, they say, because I said so. Yep. That's an appeal to their own authority.
Right.
I'm your parent, therefore I am right.
I may or may not have a good reason, but because I said so.
exactly.
That's why.
Yeah, and that's,
or when used in a more adult context, conspiracy theorists might find some obscure person with a PhD who happens to agree with their conspiracy theory and say, well, this person's got a PhD. He must know what he's talking about.
right. And, yeah, no. So, okay. I'm going to keep burning through these if that's all right with you, because I guarantee you I might get to the one that you got.
I know that you will.
I mean, you can go ahead and knock some up too. I'll just try to.
I've got two that tie into the
let's do those.
Appeal to ignorance. So, the burden of proof fallacy, or shifting the burden of proof.
Yes.
In which someone proposes an argument, someone else denies the argument, and the person who originally made the assertion puts the burden of proof on the one that's questioning it.
Right. I like looking at this one through the legal sense, whereas it's not always required, but it's easier for me to understand.
Right.
And so I even swap terms out as the assuming the responsibility of the defendant to disprove a claim made by the
Plaintiff.
Yep. Yeah. So that's the way I look at it, because it's a little easier to understand. It's more adversarial, but it's easier to understand.
The classic illustration of the burden of proof fallacy is Russell's teapot. Familiar with Russell's teapot?
I'm not actually familiar with that one.
Okay. You know who Bertrand Russell is?
Yes.
Okay. So this is Bertrand Russell came up with this. That's why it's named after him. Russell asserts there exists a microscopic teapot in orbit about Mars, the planet Mars.
Okay.
Do you believe me?
No.
Well, why not? You can't prove it's not there. Right.
Right.
So this illustrates the problem with the burden of proof of fallacy, is that this opens the door to assert literally anything and very easily cover your tracks by saying, oh, well, it's microscopic, so you can't look out there with a telescope and see. You'll never find it. And also the black and white fallacy.
Yes.
Goes along with the appeal to ignorance. That and my pet example of the black and white fallacy is pick your creationist religion here versus evolution.
Right.
These are not black and white. Let's take, the common example in the United States would be Christian creationists who go to great lengths to disprove evolution as a way of arguing the validity of their creationism. But this fails to acknowledge that there might be an alternative explanation, that even if evolution were totally and utterly disproven, where there could be no further evidence to support it. The Christian in this example still has all their work ahead of them to get to creationism.
Right.
Disproving evolution only gets us back to, I don't know where species came from.
Right. And that's formally referred to as the false dichotomy fallacy.
Right.
So that's why I had an issue finding it in my notes. You also hear this a lot especially when, well, I'm going to pull up another fallacy, because you hear false dichotomy. Fallacies are good to couple together, and that's why they're difficult, because they're so easy to couple together, because it's just like playing with Legos. You can do whatever you want with them. You can couple false
dichotomies.
Yeah, you can couple false dichotomies with things like false causes as well.
Yep.
And the false cause fallacy is simply implying a causation from a correlation. Now, in true philosopher's fashion, we should probably define correlation and causation, because I feel like they do get used interchangeably a lot in, you know what I'm saying, like in the leisure domain.
I guess so.
I hear them used pretty interchangeably from time to time, especially when I use the word causal and someone said correlation, and then they just start using the word causal as well because I said it. I don't know. I feel like people have a bad habit.
I don't experience this normally,
Okay.
so.
Well, I talk to a lot more leisure domainly people, I guess. I don't know. I don't actually have the definition pulled up in front of me, but I can get it real quick. In a nutshell, causation is the act of causing something, which is very self-explanatory.
Yes.
But in the second definition is the relationship between a cause and an effect.
Right.
Is the causality. Essentially saying an act occurs, the result occurs afterwards.
Right.
Directly implying that this will cause this every time. Ideal causality would be something that's replicatable every time.
Right. Whereas a correlation would be two or more things happening in a particular way together.
Right, or it's a mutual relationship or connection between two or more things.
Right.
They just so happen to occur.
But one may or may not cause the other, or they may both be caused by something else.
Right. So, you can sometimes use correlations, like strong repetitive correlations, to try to infer causation. That happens in statistics a lot. They look at correlations because statistics isn't really trying to answer the question of what causes what. It's just trying to say what happens to occur with what anyway.
Right.
But you will oftentimes see people use statistics poorly to imply causation.
Right.
So that's where you get that from. Well, while we move to another one, let's call up another really common one you hear a lot. Red herrings.
Yes, red herrings.
Good old red herrings. Essentially, they're irrelevant points, typically used as distractions in an argument. That's the note that it had with it, because that's really all they are.
Right.
So.
Right. You might be, someone experiencing some harsh criticism from an opponent in a debate may say, well, what about this?
What about isms?
Yes.
That's what they're frequently called today.
Right.
Because you hear them a lot in the
red
news.
herring, just deliberately distracting from the criticism.
Right.
To avoid confrontation.
Now, red herrings can also be kind of looped in with ad hominems.
A little bit.
A little bit. Now, an ad hominem is arguing, and the definition I had, I think, was really good. It's arguing against your opponent and not their argument.
Right. Now, something that I would like to mention here is that an ad hominem attack is not necessarily an ad hominem fallacy.
Correct. That's why my definition is the way it is.
Right. An ad hominem attack is literally just an insult.
Right.
Insult somebody that you're arguing with. Okay. But it becomes an ad hominem fallacy when you attempt to substitute your insult for an actual argument.
Right.
So, if I'm debating with somebody and I so rudely call them an idiot because I think that they are, that's not a fallacy if I then proceed to explain the argument why I said that. It's only a fallacy if I say, you're an idiot, case closed.
Right. And there are two, that can tie into two other fallacies. The first one is tu quo qui.
Yes. Also known as the
who are you to say, or the who are you to say fallacy, or more commonly, yet not quite as accurately, the hypocrite fallacy.
Well, I was going to say the appeal to hypocrisy.
I don't call it an appeal, but it's fine. Definitions. My definition is not the same. But that's claiming the claiming the act of sorry, I got this tongue-tied. Claiming the act of acting in a discordance with an individual's claim proves its falsity.
Right.
So it's the age-old, the smoker parent telling their children not to smoke. You'll hear people say the do as I say, not as I do. Mm-hmm. Sometimes gets lopped in with that. Whereas the reality is my actions have no bearing on my arguments.
Right. Well, smoking will give you cancer, whether someone telling you that is a smoker or not.
Right. And the other one that kind of Are you giving me moving on to the next one?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get through these because there's a lot of them.
Yes, there are.
Is the no true Scotsman fallacy.
Ah, yes, my favorite.
Which is essentially modifying or asserting a definition to deny evidence. Not quite the same. It can be used and coupled with the tu quoque, which is the French, I think, definition. I don't know. It's irrelevant. It's essentially, it's called the no true Scotsman because, well, all true Scotsmen put sugar in their porridge.
No, don't put sugar in their porridge.
Don't put sugar in their porridge. If you do, then you must not be a true Scotsman.
Right.
So.
Well, and to draw it out, the part that makes it a fallacy is that the original claim is that no Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge.
Right.
Someone raises their hand, I'm a Scotsman and I put sugar in my porridge. Well, no true Scotsman puts sugar in his porridge.
Right.
Yes.
I'm going to go ahead and finish up this page. Then there is the personal incredulity.
Yes.
And that is refuting a claim based on the refuter's ability, lack of ability, or unwillingness to comprehend the claim.
Right.
That's seemingly a harsh way to define it, but that's essentially the person you are arguing with, or your interlocutor, you should say. If they can't understand the claim you're trying to make, and they then use their lack of ability to understand, or their lack of willingness to try to understand as an argument for its falsity.
Right. I can't get my head around it, therefore it's wrong.
Right. And there's a principle out there that is sometimes called in when people use this fallacy. You'll hear Occam's razor brought in a lot, which is an entirely different thing from a different field, which doesn't need to be used.
But that's the thing about fallacies, is they often skirt the line between philosophical shortcut and cheating.
Right. Fallacies also tend to come in pairs sometimes, which I really dislike because they're essentially the same thing in the negative. There's affirming the consequent, which is essentially just implying a causal relationship from a correlation in the positive manner. Right. The definition I could give is, well, one smoker committed murder, therefore all smokers are murderers. Right, okay. And it can grow from there. And then denying the antecedent is the opposite fallacy, which is, I'm trying to wrap this into a way I can understand it, is no smoker this one smoker has never murdered anybody, therefore no smokers murdered anybody. Schmirkers. Getting tongue-tied here. Let's see. Moving the goalpost is insanely common these days. And that's when you alter, typically narrowing the scope of a claim when you're pressed on it. That's the definition I have. That's kind of more of a casual definition. Right. Do you have any alternate definitions for that? That might be a little better.
Definitions? No. I mean, when someone comes up with a counterexample to a claim, and then this is followed by backpedaling and redefining what the goal was supposed to be, right, so that it escapes the exception that was raised.
Right. The goal, or sometimes when you're arguing definitions, you modify the definition in a way that narrows down what it means back from your original argument. And I would argue that moving the goalpost, there's a thin line, as there typically are with fallacies. Sometimes moving the goalpost is a good thing. For the overarching goal, what could be construed as moving the goalpost can be a good thing.
There's a distinction between moving the goalposts and clarifying a claim.
Right.
And there's a fine line between those.
They get blurred all the time. Right. And so, most fallacies, you have to be careful.
The difference is that one is honest and one is not. That's really what it comes down to.
Right.
That a true case of moving the goalposts is admitting defeat, but not really admitting it.
Right.
You're saying, oh, well, yeah, you got me, but what about this? What if I say it this way?
Right. Well, another thing, a lot of fallacies pretty much have to deal with honesty and dishonesty in your tactic. loaded questions specifically as well do this, and that's when a loaded question is a question based on an assumption where the answer to the question would imply the truth or the truth state of the assumption. So you typically hear these in compound questions, Well, if murderers are redheads, and wouldn't you say that most? No, that doesn't really go. I'm having a hard time coming up with instances tonight, David.
I can tell.
I'm fried. Do you have a good instance for loaded questions?
A loaded question.
They're kind of hard to do when you're just trying to think of one. Like if I was in a debate, it'd be a little easier because I'd have assertions in front of me that I could pick from and then wrap in a question. Oh, here's a good one. Okay. This one gets used all the time these days. I don't know why I didn't think of it earlier. Do you believe that we should listen to all victims? See, if you say yes, then you're implying that the group being discussed that it wasn't brought up in the sentence, but the implied group are victims.
Right.
And that can typically be used to lop everybody who needs to be listened to in as a victim. Right. So that gets used a lot these days. Not trying to be too topical, but anybody who has a TV or a radio probably has heard something to that effect. Right. You find these a lot in politics, too. Mm-hmm. As we try to avoid politics, when you start talking about fallacies, it's hard not to overlap.
I don't think we should avoid politics, just current events.
Politics of the day, right, if you will.
And the thing about a lot of fallacies is that they show up most common in a political context. Well, right. Not in a political context. They are used frequently by politicians.
Right. Well, I think the reason you see them, most frequently by politicians, and I think the reason you see that is because most modernized debate platforms are adversarial in the nature that both people aren't trying to reach the truth. They're trying to reach, winning over their opponent.
They've already made up their minds about what it is their conclusion is made up. No one is coming to a political debate to reconsider their conclusions. They're coming to assert their conclusions and talk about why they believe them, which may have good reasons or may not. And in the case that they don't, the fallacies come out.
Right. And most people give in to them or let them happen because they're kind of hard to notice in the moment because they come out quick and you're under a lot of pressure usually when you're in a debate like that. But even the audience is okay with them because there's the thrill of the conflict going on as well. That kind of enraptures people. Right. Especially people who want to actually buy tickets and show up to a debate, a political debate. I have no idea where you buy tickets to go to the presidential debate. I have no idea if you can. But the people who end up going are people who want to see the clash, you know.
Well, and the other thing is that, let's say that you're the most honest political candidate who ever existed.
You poor soul.
Yeah, right. And so you are engaged in a debate with your opponent, and they use a fallacy, and you decide to call them out on it. This opens the door for them to use other dishonest tactics like, I forget the formal name for this, but basically throwing a whole bunch of fallacies at you at once, and you can never possibly answer them all. And so at the end, to the people who are on your opponent's side already, it looks like you failed to address everything, because you did, and therefore your opponent's right.
Right. Yeah, I have no idea what that would be called.
There is a formal name for that, but I've forgotten it.
Right. Another fallacy that you committed last week, I called you out on it, is hasty generalizations. And we're both guilty of it because the colloquial name for these are typically anecdotes. Yes. We use those a lot, which people use anecdotes a lot because...
Well, anecdotes are not bad. Anecdotes are not necessarily fallacious. They're only fallacious when you're trying to submit an anecdote as if it is evidence.
Right. And that's what the definition is, a conclusion or evidence formed from a small or biased sample. Right. Your one experience as an individual is considered a small sample. Hasty generalizations can also lead to slippery slopes as well. and slippery slopes are another fallacy. And that's where asserting that an outcome or position will inevitably lead to another certain outcome or position. You hear it called the snowball effect sometimes, where, well, if we let one person do it, then 50 more people will want to, and then 1,000, and people generally get away with this because it seems somewhat logically correct, but it's taken to a hyperbolic extreme most of the time. And there's a difference between using slippery slopes and taking things to their hyperbolic extremes. We do that all the time, where we take each other's assertions and apply them in the most extreme context.
But that's only taking the one assertion and taking it alone to its most extreme conclusion.
Exactly. We don't bring in any other things, or if we do, we make sure you got to go back and clarify it and qualify it back with your original assertion as well. So, let's see, the next one, Sardis Paradox, or the decision point fallacy. This is a weird one that you don't hear about very often, but I think comes up in certain topics. And that's the fallacy that continuums prevent adequate distinctions, therefore nothing meaningful can be gained from them. So essentially, dogs are mammals, right? Dogs are mammals, dogs are mammals and lizards are reptiles. Reptiles lay eggs, but dogs don't lay eggs. But what about platypuses or platypi? They do lay eggs. See, everything exists on a continuum, so what's the point in drawing arbitrary boundaries? And because of that, they could make the argument that lizards and dogs are basically the same. Right. That's kind of where it goes to, is you water down definitions to the point where nothing means anything anymore, and without definitions...
So then you can say whatever you want.
You can say whatever you want. Which you kind of can technically do that anyway, but no one's going to take you seriously in a debate when you do that. My least favorite fallacy, or my most favorite fallacy, I'm not sure. The middle ground fallacy?
Yes.
Ooh.
The assertion that the truth always lies between.
No. Or as a combination of various positions, if they're complex positions. Oh, why don't we take... You hear this in politics all the time, Republicans in the United States typically be better at fiscal stuff, whereas the Democrats tend to be better at social stuff. So why don't we just have a policy that takes one of both? And that's the middle ground. It'll be perfect. Everything will work out great. Whereas you have no reason to believe that, and there's no evidence to support that. It's just overarching and lopping things together. But no, I hate that argument because, A, I like debating sometimes, and I don't like to think that I'm wrong. No one else does. Right. And also, I feel like it's kind of a cheap cop-out because I feel like a lot of people tend to agree to the middle ground fallacy when they're just tired.
Well, yeah. Well, that's why the conclusion of the implementation of a middle ground fallacy is called a compromise.
Oof. That's true, though. The great compromise.
Either one of us
the
can
great
get
middle
what we
ground.
want, so let's do something else that's sort of almost like what some of what we want is like.
But we're both going to still be unhappy about it.
Right.
It's probably not going to last.
And it might actually make everything worse in the process.
See, great compromise, TM.
Right.
Or the great middle ground fallacy, as it is
Great
forced to be known. You've got genetic fallacies as well, which doesn't mean exactly what you think it means.
Right.
Genetic fallacies are arguing that a point is the truth assignment value of a point is based on a prerequisite source of the point, I guess, is the most general way I could put it. But it's essentially saying, well, because this is false, then this is false. Right. Whereas, while the two things may be related, the relationship of falseness or truthness is exclusive to each. But you imply that it is not. It's kind of like, this isn't really what it is, but it's kind of like saying, well, you were wrong about that thing earlier, so why can't you be wrong about this thing now?
Right.
Which is kind of an ad hominem mixed with the genetic fallacy. But another way you could say this is it's kind of an expansion of the fallacies of composition and division, kind of, or maybe the root to these things. The fallacy of composition is essentially saying if it is true of a subset, then it is true of the superset.
Right, which is the opposite of how it works.
Well, that's
the real way it works is if it's true of a superset, then it is true of a subset.
Right. Well, there is also the fallacy of division, whereas the state of the superset is indicative of the state of the subset. But I'm not talking about in strict logic. And
supersets do imply things about subsets, though.
They do, but not all things. Think about it more Venn diagram.
So not subsets, but overlap.
Overlap, yeah. I use the terms sets and subsets. I guess they use the term sets and subsets in the casual definition, not in the strict logical definition. Because the example of the fallacy of division is saying, well, let's see. I gotta be careful here. Because as soon as you start making sweeping generalizations, which is also what these are, about people, it can get dicey. Okay, here's a good example. All dogs bark, therefore that one dog barks. Well, there's such a thing as mute dogs, so.
Well, that's just a problem with the premise isn't true.
Well, it's a fallacy. It is, technically. Well, anytime, okay.
Because basically, the problem with that is that you made the assertion all dogs bark. Well, I found a dog that doesn't bark. Okay, then the assertion is false.
Right.
That's not really a fallacy.
Okay, what about most dogs bark, therefore this one dog must bark?
Read to me the definition again.
It's the state of a superset is indicative of the state of the subset. I can try to find you a better definition or a different definition. Okay, the fallacy of division occurs when one reasons logically that something true for the whole must also be true for all or some of its parts. Like a good example would be like, you are David, therefore your lung is David.
Right.
Whereas it's not entirely true. Your lung is a sub-part of you.
Right. This is more of like a problem of language, really. Because, like, maybe I catch a virus or something and you say, I'm sick. Okay. But if it's a cold, let's say, well, that doesn't really affect my muscles. My muscles aren't sick. It's the other organs that are sick.
Right. Perhaps. Then again, all debates are language. So right. I guess that's why it's a fallacy, is when you start employing that problem of language.
The problem is that, if I say I'm sick, if we use that in a very, very formal sense, if we were talking about some very abstract thing and we said this thing has the property of being sick, then we imply the whole thing. But when I tell you I'm sick, I don't literally mean every part of my body is sick.
Right, but I guess in that case the fallacy of division would be assuming that that is true.
Right.
Or, well, that's the fallacy of composition.
It's taking a true property of supersets and subsets, but then...
What's including outliers?
Well, it's exploiting the careless or casual use of language to then make a claim about supersets.
Right. Okay.
I think that's more like there was something else that I was going to say, but I forgot the word for it. We may get to it actually. So
we could. Second to last, there's the gambler's fallacy. And that's implying a pattern as evidence when there are non-causal factors.
This one is very easy to fall into. There's something very deep in the psyche about this.
Well, I mean, yeah, look at how well casinos are doing.
Right.
They have always done.
Well, but not everyone who goes to a casino loses money because of the gambler's fallacy.
It's a huge contributing factor, though.
The gambler's fallacy is a huge contributing factor in gambling problems.
Right. Okay, I would say the gambler's fallacy probably arises from the psychological reasons the gambler's fallacy exists, prevalence, probably also contributes to other things like Skinner's boxes and things like that. Not to go too far, because that's not really what we're talking about today. Right. Or any other system that's designed to be exploitative of those systems, which is it's essentially exploiting your reward system in the brain, which is it's just how your own brain encourages itself to do things.
So to take the gambler's fallacy away from the formal definition, because you give a very technical definition, the classic example of the gambler's fallacy is in a casino, you're at a roulette wheel, and it's landed on red the past 10 times in a row, and you're like, okay, it's about time for it to land on black. Except that there is a non-zero chance that it could land on red every single time for the rest of the night. Because each time the roulette wheel is spun, there's a 50-50 chance of it landing on red or black. The previous instances of it landing on red do not make it more likely for the next one to be black.
Right.
And that's what makes it a fallacy.
Right. Well, people use it in the opposite as well, which is, it's landed on red the past 10 times. Well, it's going to land on red again, It's been doing it so often that pretty much, anytime you employ that pattern as evidence, And the last one, and the one I think people hear about more than any other fallacy, and I think one of the hardest ones to accurately identify, straw manning.
Yes, the straw man fallacy, which is where you misrepresent the position of your opponent in a way that is easier to defeat and then defeat it.
So, can I quote, insert link for Kathy Newman and Jordan Peterson here.
Okay.
Yeah. So what you're saying is...
Right. Yes.
You hear that?
Well, that's not necessarily indicative of fallacy. You might just be trying to get clarification.
Again, it depends on whether you're being honest or not.
Right, exactly.
And I feel like there's also an element of subconscious, or there might be an element of subconscious dishonesty here, where I guess it also kind of depends on your intentions of the debate as well.
In the case of the Kathy Newman thing, I think that there was an assumption there that Jordan Peterson was up to no good.
Right.
And so then trying very quickly to come to a conclusion that he's being very rash.
Right. Or that, he's bad, therefore I'm going to take the worst possible interpretation I can conceive of what he said.
And see if he agrees to it.
Right, and use it as a framework, because that might also legitimately be the way she thought of it.
Right.
And what he meant, so it was honest, but it's still a fallacy in the way that it would be a fallacy if it was assumed, whether it's a clarification,
Right.
So I guess the difference is what you're saying is, or, what you said was, and then you take it to the hyperbolic extreme.
Right. Now we're talking a little bit too much about a specific thing that people may not have seen.
That's true.
Actually, and I think it might be better, instead of linking to the original discussion, to link to counter-arguments.
I was going to say that. Yeah. Counter-arguments is a great one where he picks up this fallacy and specifically and just...
Well, and in that specific case as well.
Yes, and he runs a scoreboard on it. It's awesome.
It's fantastic. Yeah. So there's one fallacy you forgot about that at least I have. Well, there are many fallacies that we probably have not covered.
Oh, I'm sure.
Special pleading.
Ooh, I did not have that one in my notes. What's that definition, my friend?
Well, special pleading is, I don't have a formal definition here, but when someone makes a claim, which is then refuted, and then appealing to a special case to make it true. So the example that I have is, suppose you have someone who claims to be a psychic, okay? And so you say, okay, I'm going to put your alleged psychic powers to the test. Of course, they fail.
Then they move the goalpost.
Well, then they say, my psychic powers only work if you first have faith that they work.
Oh, so special pleading is like moving the goalpost, but moving them to a very specific place.
Right.
But
they're saying, the reason why my psychic powers failed is because you didn't do your test right.
Or the age-old, is Santa Claus real? I don't know. It depends on if you believe or not.
Right.
What?
If you believe that Santa Claus is real, then he's real. No. That's special pleading.
Oh, and there is the ultimate fallacy that we forgot to actually mention because I was saving it for last on purpose.
Yes.
The fallacy.
The fallacy, where just because your opponent uses a fallacy doesn't mean that their conclusion is wrong.
Yep. And this is kind of the one where I love doing this one last because it makes it seem like the last hour of us talking was a waste of time. But it's not.
It's not.
It's just simply acknowledging that just because you can point out fallacies and highlight them in your opponent, you still have work to do.
Right. It doesn't make you right because your opponent gave a bad argument.
Right. And it also depends, and I think this is an important point to make for what we talk about when we debate or discuss or engage in discourse. Fallacies oftentimes occur advertently in adversarial debates where the point of the debate is not reaching the truth or clearing up or gaining more knowledge or insight. They still can occur when you're trying to do those things. You're trying to gain insight or just gain more knowledge or reach a conclusion together as individuals. But I feel like the fallacy, I guess the way you would feel about the fallacy would depend on what you're trying to do in that debate. You know, it might seem disheartening if you're just trying to defeat your opponent. But I view it as a positive thing. Because I'll be honest, when I first read it, I was like, oh, that stinks. Why'd I spend all this time writing in these pages in this notebook? It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But after I thought about it a little more, it kind of occurred to me that this is a good thing. This means that we can move on and we can still refine arguments after the fallacy is pointed out. Mm-hmm. And we can make adjustments to our arguments or remove a fallacious supporting argument from your initial claim to then clarify it and move on, which I think is important because that's really what we're trying to do. Do you have anything to say else about it?
I don't.
Okay. There's a few other things that I wanted to kind of bring up that I feel like are maybe tertiary topics that kind of come around or with these, or peripheral topics that kind of get brought up as well. It's the idea of the truth assignment itself, which we've already touched on. I just want to bring it back and talk about it. The truth assignment is essentially the core algorithm for determining the truthfulness of a claim. That's what we defined it as.
Right.
And we've talked about this at length in multiple episodes now. This point, I believe. Mm-hmm. And just highlighting that, the truth assignment is unique to each person. Just making that clear. And I also want to bring up the term dogma because I feel like we have used and use these two terms a lot, or will use these two terms a lot. And I just want to go ahead and get some definitions out of the way. Dogma is essentially a principle or a set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertible fact. Mm-hmm. If that definition contains within itself a few fallacies, or can, by an authority. So if you're citing dogma, you are implying its authority, or saying that it is true because of who said it, but you hear it used a lot. So those are a couple of tertiary terms that I came across a bunch while looking at these things up, and I wanted to go ahead and mention them as well, since if you stuck with us for the last hour or so, you kind of figured out that we may or may not be priming you for something, or we may or may not be laying out a bunch of definitions in advance because we're going to talk about something bigger. Mm-hmm.
Do we want to reveal what it is?
I think we can reveal what it is because it'll debut in December, which is
next week.
Well, 2 weeks for them. No, you're right. Next week.
Next
week. No, next week. That's right. So what are we doing, David?
We will be doing a 4-part lecture series about Christianity.
I hate it when you call it a lecture, though. I like lectures myself, but I can just hear some people groaning and eye-rolling to it. But
well, for anyone who has made it this far, guess what? For the last hour, you've been listening to a lecture, because that's sort of what this was.
It really was.
There were no arguments here, really.
No.
So this is more of the lecture form. So it will be like this.
That is true. And it's something that we've kind of been secretly priming for all along. It's definitely not the point of what we're doing. No. Back in episode 1, we said our goal is to find the truth, or to search for the truth, more adequately.
I think we were a couple of episodes in before we decided to do this.
We were. We'd already been a few episodes in, and
so it's not like we got together a couple of months ago and said, okay, we'd really like to do a 4-part lecture series about Christianity, so let's start a show and
do an 8-part primer on. So we hope you like it. David has put an absolutely large amount of work into it, or at least he has led me to believe as such. And I'll be honest, it's kind of his pet project. A little bit for this. Which I think is a good thing, because that means one of us has to be responsible, and the other can just try to poke holes in your responsibility.
Right.
So we might retain a little bit of the discourse that we normally have, but it is mostly going to be along the lines of laying out a case that I feel that both of us think is important, given our anecdotal experience in our own lives, and it's something that I think we both have not a unique experience with, or not an entirely unique experience with, because without getting too much into personal lives, I was born I wasn't born a Christian, but depending on who you ask, I was. And I was raised as one, and it wasn't until my early 20s that I really let that go and changed my belief system. And it was difficult at the time. And it was the first time I'd ever changed belief systems or really separated my morals and principles from who I was. And it's a freeing experience, let me tell you. For me, it was absolutely freeing. I'm not going to speak for David on this.
Right. Well, I'm avoiding getting into life stories at this point in the show. But I would like to make a slight tangential comment.
Sure.
You mentioned being born a Christian. I find it, and I'm not the first one to point this out by any means, but isn't it interesting how we will refer to small children by their religion?
Yes.
Like, no one ever says, look at that little Republican kid over there,
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure people looked at George W. Bush when he was born and was like, look at that little Republican.
But, people talk about, the Christian children are going to, it's like, okay, but no one ever says, oh, well, here's Susie, she's a libertarian. No, we all acknowledge that children are not ready to be assigned these labels because they have not been given enough time to think them through, but we're very, very quick to slap a religious label on them.
Yeah. But anyway, it's something that we found fitting for the holiday season. Mm-hmm. So while we are out and about, and you are out and about, probably amongst family who may or may not be Christians, you can be listening to this and have some very interesting dinner table conversations that'll probably be excruciatingly uncomfortable.
I was about to say, maybe you shouldn't show this to your Christian family at Christmas Day. I'm just saying.
I don't know. I mean, it is Jesus' birthday. There's a false correlation right there for why this is important to show them on Christmas. No, there was some pretty heavy sarcasm that I don't know comes across in the audio when we clean it up. But oof. Need to go back and rewatch a few episodes now. But it is something we've been excited about doing, and now that we've been doing this for 2 months, we thought it'd be a good idea. This is all David's idea. I'm going to throw him under the bus or on the file, I guess, depending on whether this goes well or goes poorly. But I felt that we could do this, and it would be a good test of ourselves to hold together a full 4-part series. And then, because we've been wanting to make a few bigger changes going into the new year as well, keeping our goals in mind, but just making improvements. So this is going to get us over the hump. And again, I think the most important thing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but we aren't trying to make up anyone's minds for them when we do any of this. Like, the whole point of doing this is so that we, David and I, can get closer to the truth and work things out amongst ourselves and maybe provide a model for others to take and put their own spin on it. You know, I mean, we recommend a lot of street epistemology. We've recommended Anthony Magnabosco before. There's a couple of other ones. I think there's one that's just called Street Epistemology.
Mm-hmm. Oh, there's lots of street epistemology channels now, which excites me.
Yeah. This isn't that, but it's taking that indoors with two people who've known each other for a while and really grinding down on points much deeper than you could in a 30-minute or 15 to 30-minute talk. And so I feel like I have to caveat this because while it matters, I think, what we talk about, it is important for everyone to also know that, you know, we want people to listen to this because they want to listen to it and because they find it interesting. And we hope that what we talk about, you know, our topics, our discussion, our points are what have people listening, not, you know, my silky smooth voice or lack thereof, you know. So, and the only reason I'm doing more shilling than normal is because we're about to launch into something big, and it's
right.
And I'm excited. So,
and it's important also to say to extend that just a little bit that we do not claim to be the arbiters of the truth.
That is correct.
And so whatever may be said in this upcoming lecture series that may seem like an assertion of the absolute truth, let's call it what it is. An argument, which can be argued against, and criticism is, of course, very welcome.
Of course, as long as it is in good faith, and you know, there's a difference between criticisms and insults, or ad hominems, as the fancy word we learned tonight. So I don't know about you, David, but I'm pretty much looking forward to it.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to it.
And with that all being said, you know. We are the philosophers.
Yes, the Fauxlosophers.